So we proposed a new way of settling in Modular Loop, which would settle by batches, not by windows, would define the segmentation of batches by time or indeed by other characteristics of the transfer, so that people could decide what their batches were going to contain, that they could get different kinds of transfers into different batches, all of that kind of stuff. We wanted to make it both flexible and deterministic so that people could be completely confident that a particular transfer would wind up in a definite batch and not simply in whatever happened to be available. We also wanted to be able to support multiple settlement models, which were also based on the characteristics of transfers, so that in cases where, for instance, people were doing foreign exchange or where they were receiving remittances, those transfers could be segmented from the other transfers and settled in different ways, on different timescales, in different ways of working. We also wanted to be able to create batches automatically. At the moment, those of you who've used Modular Loop will know that there's essentially a manual process that just says, okay, I'm going to stop putting my batches into this window and I'm going to start putting them into that window. We wanted to change that so that there was a defined segmentation which always said which batch a transfer would belong to. What do we want to do? Well, we wanted to have definitions of settlement models which were much more flexible so that we could much better accommodate ourselves to the requirements of particular implementations. And we wanted to provide certainty about which transfers were batched together. But basically, at the core of this, we wanted to support a significant reduction in the size of batches, settlement batches in a Modular Loop system. Why do we want to do this? Well, we only settle at the batch level. We don't have a mechanism for settling individual transfers or groups of transfers except at the batch level. Now, if a dispute is raised about a transfer, then that means that none of the transfers in that batch can be settled until the dispute is resolved. The larger the batch, it's obvious really, the more transfers will be held up if a dispute is raised. Now, I know that we work hard in the Modular Loop system to make sure that there won't be disputes. But if there are, we want them to have minimum impact on the system. So our policy objective is to support the generation of multiple small batches, which sounds fine, but there's one problem. There's going to be rather a lot of batches in the system. Now, in a multi-batch world, which is what we're talking about, we think that administrators of settlements will need to be able to work at a higher level than the window-by-window world that we currently support. At the moment, when a settlement window is created, it gets a unique identifier, and if you want to settle it, you have to tell the system what that identifier is. We want to be able to work at a higher level than that. And we intend to provide new functionality, which you'll be seeing later on, via the administration API to support this. We did this by introducing the concept of a matrix. And a matrix for us is defined by its inclusion rules, not by its content. The inclusion rule might be something like all the transfers that completed between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock yesterday. Or it might be all the currency conversion transfers in the Mwali Kwacha to Tanzanian shilling corridor today. They're dynamic, not static. You can define a window before there are any transfer batches to go into it, and the system will assign those batches to that window automatically as you go, so that you can look at that matrix at any point over the course of the year and see which batches are in it currently. And if you look at it half an hour later, there'll be more batches in it. And administrators, we expected, will be able to use them for reporting as well as for settling. Again, you'll be seeing that in the demonstrations a bit later on. But we wanted them to be able to say things like, show me all the transfers before this week that have not yet been settled. Administrators will also be able to see the status of all the batches in a matrix. Might be open or closed or settled or whatever. And we also want them to be able to drill down into the content of batches, to be able to pick a batch and say, I want to see the transfers that are in that batch. So they'll be able to settle matrices, not batches. They'll be able to place a batch in dispute, if that happens. They'll be able to change the status of one or more batches, subject to conversion rules, obviously, where, for instance, if a batch has been settled, you can't change its status to anything else. That status is final at that point. However, there is a worm in every apple. Well, not in every apple, but there's definitely a worm in this particular apple. There's a source of complication, and that is that a batch can appear in more than one matrix. Consider the case, there's a matrix for all the transfers that complete between 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock today, and another batch for all the currency conversion transfers in a particular corridor today. Now, it's easy to see that some of the batches will appear in both windows. That is to say, currency conversion transfers in that corridor that happen between 12 and 6 o'clock today. Those batches will appear in both matrices. There will be other batches that only appear in one, but we have to be able to deal with the situation of, or manage the situation of batches occurring in more than one matrix. We definitely didn't want it to be exclusive. We thought that would be unmanageable if we allowed, if we only allowed a batch to appear in one matrix. We thought that that was almost certainly going to result in batches not properly being settled, because people would not notice whether their whether their matrices were completely flush with each other or whether there were gaps between them. And as we said, a matrix can contain batches to which transfers that are still being added. So how are we going to settle open batches? If an administrator wants to settle a matrix where some batches are still open, then we close the batch and settle it. Any new transfers which would have been added to that batch appear in a separate new batch. So we never lose transfers, and we never add transfers to a batch which is in process of settlement or has been settled. The new batch will still be part of that matrix. If you look at the matrix again, you will see it there. And the overall status of the matrix will change from settled to multiple. So you'll be able to see immediately that a batch contains, that a matrix contains batches with more than one status. Something similar will be true of, pardon me, new batches, which fall within the criteria of the matrix, but had not yet been created when settlement was requested. So, what happens to batches that are appearing in multiple matrices? Well, the status belongs to a batch. And when a batch changes status, it retains that status in every matrix in which it appears. A batch can only be settled, though, by one matrix. And when it is, it appears as settled in all the other matrices to which it belongs. Make sense? Makes sense to me. Makes sense, Pedro? Yeah, it makes sense to us. It's complicated, but we haven't thought of a better alternative yet. And we are open to all comments and suggestions. I mean, I kind of keep wanting to think that there must be a simpler way of doing this, and we just haven't found it yet. But you'll see, I hope, when we come around to do the actual demonstration, that this is something that is workable. And the complications are more to do with the fact, I think, that we need to make sure that we're properly dealing with all of the edge cases than they are to do with the fact that the whole process is going to be complicated in operation. I mean, we imagine, for instance, that in a standard scheme, Once it's set up, the administrators will say, okay, I'm going to settle, let's say, 3 times a day. This is when the settlements will occur. The batches will happen at a 5-minute interval, let's say, and my matrices will be defined in the settlement periods that I want. They'll just go into those settlement periods after a certain amount of time, after the settlement matrix criteria have closed. You'll just be able to say, settle that one, please. Everything in the batch will be settled, and that's it. So we imagine that there are, if this situation is operated in a simple way, then it won't be necessary for people to have any consciousness of the kind of complications that I'm talking to you about. However, when we're designing these things, we need to think about the edge cases and make sure we can accommodate them. If we can find a simpler way of accommodating them, then, as I say, we are very much open to suggestions.
So I appreciate you changing the terminology. It's a long time coming. We've been sort of misusing the term settlement window for a while. It's actually what a settlement window actually is the period during the day in which the reserve bank accepts settlement files. And in fact, there's really a couple of settlement windows. There's the receipt window when the files are allowed in the building. And then there is a processing window, which is when we actually open the files and do something about them. And as you point out, it can happen several times during the day. So it's a reference to when do we do the work, not what did we put in it.
Yeah.
The settlement file is the term that they would use for the settlement instructions, if you will, that they receive that may be glued together and handed in mechanically that way. But of course, we haven't done it that way for 40 years. So some of the terminology doesn't matter, but I'm glad we're back to batches because you're going to settle in batches. And that's great. I do want to not take time now, but I want to understand better.
Okay.
At what point do you assign a transaction, a transfer to a settlement batch?
Sure.
And it would seem to me there are several logical places, but it usually the devil's in the details as to when we know things and when we don't know them. So it'd be useful to follow up on that. And then with those answers, maybe iterate with you guys on what happens next.
I should probably say that the term settlement batch is the Moduloop memorial to Pierre Combel, who first used the term settlement batch when we originally started talking about them. So round of applause for Pierre. Respect is due. All right. Suit yourselves. Okay, shall we go and have our demonstration? Let me hear you say, yeah.
So, yes, let me take you through everything that Michael explained in practice, and we can see where we can uncover some edge cases. So for today's demo, we have 2 participants. The green bank and the blue bank are the DFSPs that we'll be using. And in our example, the blue bank will be the payee and the green bank will be the payer. Now, I went ahead and created some transactions earlier today. So we can see here in the account balances that there's a credit balance in the position account, and there's a healthy balance in the settlement liquidity account for the blue bank. So I'm going to move over to the green bank to see similar results. We can see that there's a debit balance in the position account and another healthy credit balance on settlement, on the liquidity. So before we jump into the transfers and the batches and the matrix, I want to just discuss the model. So at this point for this use case, we've only have one settlement model, and the settlement batches are created and named or identified based on the model, the currency, and as well as the date and time and the sequence. So I'm gonna jump ahead and look at the batches. So at this point, we can see these are the transactions that were created earlier today, and some have been settled and some have not been settled. And if I run and some of them are even still open. So this is typically something that's going to have to be managed by the hub operator in defining exactly when you want to be closing batches and setting those to close every depending on the duration of a batch. Then right after the duration is expired, you would want to go and close a batch, or shortly thereafter. And yeah, that's completely up to the hub operator, and it's completely flexible. You also don't have to create batches of very short time spans, but as Michael mentioned, it creates a problem when you're doing dispute. So let's jump into the first use case here, where I'm going to go and create a dispute. Now, usually you'll create a dispute starting off with a transfer. So for example, let's say there's a transfer that is fraudulent, or there's a valid reason for disputing that a transfer, which will not actually dispute the transfer, but the batch that transfer belongs to. So I'm going to a transfer, and there's a transfer that's been committed recently, a two-phase transfer. And when we click on that, I can do a lookup for that transfer in settlements. And there we go. I can see now in settlements where this transfer has been allocated, which is not pointing to the original transfer, but it's actually a settlement transfer. And before I jump into detail here, it's important to note that the accounts that gets created for a batch only live in that batch. So if you have a participant that didn't do any transfers for a period of time, we won't go ahead and create accounts that won't have transfers. So all of the accounts are linked to a particular batch, but they all have ties back into the original DFSP. And that goes the same for the actual settlement transfers. And one of the things, the main driver, if you will, for the timestamp for when for the batch that the transfer is going to be allocated to is driven by the fulfillment timestamp. So settlement is not in control of the timestamp. Therefore, if you've got a scenario where a batch has been closed and you have a transfer coming in, settlements will go ahead and notice that there's no open batch for a transfer to go to, and it will create a new batch, and that batch will follow the similar pattern to what we see here. The only difference is now the sequence will not be 001, it will be 002, because once you've closed the batch, that batch is final. You can always go ahead and dispute the batch and tag it for settlement, but you will never be able to send any transfers there. That batch is final. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and so there's two variations of the matrix, and the first is the one that Michael mentioned, where you dynamically you're able to add new batches into a settlement as they are being created. But the other use case is when you need to perform a dispute, you want to be able to point to very specific batches and create a static matrix from that batch in order to dispute it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a static matrix over here, and we can see that there's no settlement models, there's no start or end dates. It's just purely pointing to a very specific batch over here. And I can now see this batch is currently open. And if we look at the transfers here, I'm not creating new transfers to be coming into this batch, but however many transfers were allocated to this batch during the life cycle, or while the batch was in an open status, will be listed here. But since this batch is still open and valid, we want to be able to close this batch. Or sorry, dispute this batch. So what we do now is we execute an action on the matrix, and the matrix will go and perform the actual dispute. So we can see here now, I've just clicked the dispute button, and this batch is now in a disputed status. So if we go back to the batches or the lookup screen, we can see here that we've got a batch that's now disputed. So this batch will not be settled ever until it's not in a non-disputed status, and then it can be taken forward again. So I'm going to go ahead and create a dynamic matrix, and we can see here, not in this example, but you are able to mix and match currencies for your settlement matrix. The only rule is that you cannot have different currencies within batches, but a matrix can have batches that are in different currencies, different statuses. All of that's very flexible and configurable by the hub operator and driven by the hub operator. And to show an example of where that was the case, we can see here when in terms of the sequencing, you can see that the last the bottom two lines over here, we've got a settlement batch that has the exact same name, but in one of the cases, you can see that the sequence was incremented so that if a transfer comes in late, it will be very easy for the operator to identify a batch that is coming late, or that's coming in where it doesn't belong. So I'm going to create the first dynamic matrix over here, and I'm just going to tweak the start date a bit. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So I've created a dynamic matrix now, but I didn't actually want to do what I just did. I want to tweak the time here, do a search. So I can see that there's currently only one batch in this matrix. So I'll go ahead and create a dynamic matrix. But I also want to create a matrix that spans for the whole day. So let me go back to the batches, and I will leave the data as is and create another dynamic matrix. And you can see now I've got a whole bunch of batches that's in mixed states, even settled, even some disputed. I can now look at the various balances based on the participants and the currencies and the statuses as well. So you can see this is essentially the visual display of the settlement matrix. You can very easily see for how many, based on the status and the participants, what each of the debit and credit balances are. You can look at state only. You can look at the currency balances, so you can see the totals here. And lastly, we can look at the individual transfers that belongs to this matrix. And we can see here that there's quite a few transfers that belongs to this batch. And I can now, depending on what the status of the matrix is, the matrix also actually has a status, but it's a lot more toned down because the matrix is essentially there to control the batches. And your matrix really only has a state of idle and finalized, which is the important, well, there's more statuses, but it's more to manage things like concurrency and making sure that, there's not any locking of resources, or like there's exclusive locking of resources. But yeah, once a matrix is actually finalized, it's similar in the sense to a batch where a batch is settled. You cannot touch it anymore. It's final. Anyway, so another really neat feature is that I'm going to go ahead and sorry, this window is in the way. I'm just trying to move it. There we go. So I think this batch, yes, this is one of the batches this is the disputed batch. So now let's say the dispute has been resolved for the transfer in this batch. So there's only one transfer, so that's great. I could have gone ahead now and settled, but fortunately this dispute has been resolved before the settlement file is being created. So I'll go ahead and close this, and now this batch can actually also now be settled. And the reason I did this is a very nice feature is, and this was built during this PI. You'll notice that there's some of the matrices that are now out of sync. So what actually happens is settlement keeps track of the batches that belong into other matrices in order for when a user looks at a matrix, he'll immediately know that this matrix is out of sync. So this is a very nice feature to make sure that you don't act on data that you're seeing on screen that might be stale. So you might implement this in a different manner where you automatically want to recalculate batches when they are, or matrices when they are out of sync. But yeah, in this case, we're doing like everything manually. So I'm going ahead and doing a refresh on the matrix or recalculate, and I now have another, I have a true view of what that matrix is, and there's one more that needs to be recalculated. And once done now, I can see that all my matrices are in sync. Next step is that we can actually go ahead and let me pick one of the larger matrices. We can actually go ahead now and firstly, we can close the matrix, which means that it will close off the batches and there will be no new transfers going into that batches, and it is progressing further to the point where we can actually settle. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. So we can see over here, I've got some settled batches already in this matrix, but those can't be touched. Once you settle a batch, it can never be settled again. It's final. But we can see here that now I've closed all of the other batches that's in this matrix. And very importantly, this is now what Michael was talking about, that you can have multiple matrices that is referencing the same batches, but very importantly, we've got this, and we spoke about it in the last PI, where you're able to lock a matrix and its batches. And what that means is that there's a tight relationship created between the batches. And let me go ahead and do that and then explain further. So I'm going to lock this batches, and we'll see that now the status for those batches is in awaiting settlement status. So what that means is that I've now created the file, and this unique identifier for my matrix is a snapshot of what is being sent to the settling bank. And this is what is going to be, what's essentially will be settled. So yes, and now also those batches know exactly which matrix did the actual settlement. So when you, we don't have it visually displayed yet, but it will definitely be there in the next month, where you will be able to see, when you look at a batch in the screen, who the only matrix is. And that gives you a very clear tie-in and network of which matrices settled which batches, and you're always able then to go to that matrix and see what was settled at that time when those batches were part of the other matrix. Anyway, so some of these batches have been settled and some not, so I'm going to go ahead and settle these. I think I've included all of the batches, but let's go see. So if we go back to our participants, I should see, there we go. Okay, so great. So we can see that the position, I didn't miss any. The position accounts are all back to 0, but let's, for argument's sake, say that there actually was, let's create another transfer real quick. So I'm just going to go ahead and create like €100 quote and transfer. Okay. I can see over here that if I go run again, if I go back to my batches now, there's one open, back to my participant, sorry. I can see that I've got another position value over here. But if I reference one of my previous matrices, you can see here, it detects that it was out of sync again. So when it recalculates, boom, I've got my open batch, because this matrix rules included the whole day until 9:57 tonight. So you'll see here that because this batch, it detected that it was out of sync, and there's still an open batch over here that all the transfers will be allocated to. I think that covers it. Yes. Any questions? Oh, I just want to mention 2 last things. So we actually already added a whole bunch of Prometheus metrics, and we will be publishing the performance statistics for settlements real soon. And also what will come is these matrices, you'll be able to get the exports in a very nicely formatted Excel file, so that you can export it and deal with actual Excel files outside of just looking at these lookups. So that is very much underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Okay, cool. Any questions for Jason? Yes, Jason, there's a comment here from Miller.
A couple for you, Jason. I think one in particular, this is first just a comment, this is amazing work. I mean, I love seeing this, how automatic everything is and how fast and organized it is. I think the one thing that I would observe is that it's a very flexible tool as presented, and it would be helpful if we had even a oversimplified run book that said, I'm a switch hub. I've decided to do 3 settlement windows during the day. And I'm going to process at the end of closing that window. And that's how I'd like to run my shop. What buttons do I press? And that would be awesome just to have that worked example. And that will give people an entry to this tool where they can experience, if I'm not mistaken, most of the screens that they'll have to go through in order to do that exercise. The other thing that I was just a comment that we can take, it's probably a detailed one later, but theoretically, you can't dispute a transfer. You can dispute a transaction, but you can't dispute a transfer. Once we have accepted it into reserve and it's prepared, we will process it to completion. And if it's committed, it will settle. And so what we've said is that if there is a problem with that, the money's already moved to the other FSP and we'll have to negotiate at the higher level in order to get it back if there's something wrong. We should interrogate that process throughout this. And then the third thing that comes out is that we will discover the other reason why we can't dispute a transfer is because of continuous gross settlement, which I think we don't yet support, but we likely would by wiring some of these things into automatic mode. Do we? So in that case, you would have no way to stand between a commitment and a settlement. It just flies through an automatic pass-through processing. So I would have said that if we do that super simple, almost one-page run book for this, then we'll have an immediate entry point for people to come at the tool. And if we were to do the same thing for continuous, they have even less to do, presumably. Here you go, Michael.
Yes.
If I can just paraphrase, Miller, what you're saying is we made it so simple, we've now got to make it even simpler. I thought so. Just checking.
That's a very valid point. We actually work is in progress to have this automation be created as a default, where you wouldn't need to. You would have like, let's say, a couple of windows set up that's linked to the actual settlement model, and you can configure the schedule that it will automatically be closing and settling as a default. And if you want to use it in a different manner, then you would go and say, oh, well, I don't want to settle immediately, or whatever the case might be. But it's definitely in the works, and I completely agree. We've been discussing it heavily in our settlements workshop, so it's on the horizon.
As you've seen, we define our batches by recurrent periods of time, every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, whatever it might be. Maybe one of the things we should think about is whether we should do the same with our matrices and allow the operators to say, I'd like a matrix for every 6 hours or something like that, so that they just get automatically generated and all the operator has to do is to say, settle.
Exactly, yes. And sorry, what I meant by the models, it would actually be the matrix. It would create the matrix, and it would yes, do exactly that. And then you can perform various actions based on these schedules. But no, absolutely. And that will ensure that nothing is overlapping, and you will always just be low maintenance.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason. And Michael, a round of applause for them.